All right, so we've learned about HTML, including page structure, tag syntax, attributes, and more. But HTML by itself is very ugly, as you've seen. So we need CSS or cascading style sheets to make our markup or HTML look presentable. So the goal of this section is to look at the fundamental CSS properties for things like fonts, colors, alignment, positioning, etc. Now, this section after this will be creating an actual website project, but I didn't want to jump right into that, right into a full project, because I want you guys to really understand what's going on and understand what these properties are doing, rather than just jump into a website project and have you copy the code and just follow along. If you're really comfortable with basic CSS, feel free to skip around. But even if you've worked with CSS before, I think that there'll be things in this section that will still help you out, that you can still learn. So here's a list of what we'll be going over in this section. I'm going to show you how to actually implement CSS. There's a few different ways. We're going to look at basic selectors so that we can actually grab different elements, whether it's by the tag name or the ID, the class. We'll look at fonts and colors and different properties, different color types like hexadecimal, RGB. We're going to look at backgrounds and borders, including background colors, background images, box model and margin and padding. We're going to look at what the box model is, what exactly margin is, where that spacing goes, where the padding goes, floating and alignment. Okay, now there are more modern ways to align things on a page, such as Flexbox and the grid system, and we're going to get into that later on. This section is all about just core basic CSS. Okay, we're also going to be looking at the display property, so display inline, display block, inline block. We'll look at styling links and buttons, creating menus such as a horizontal navigation menu as well as a vertical menu, positioning, so relative positioning, absolute, fixed, and so on, form styling, and then we're also going to be using the Google Chrome Dev Tools quite a bit to look at the HTML and CSS, as well as like the computed CSS and stuff like that. All right, so just like with the last section, we're going to have a sandbox. So this will be the CSS sandbox, where we're going to have a different file for different aspects of the section, different aspects of CSS, and you can keep this and use it if you ever need to go back to. And these files will be included in the lecture downloads. And then after this section, we're going to start putting everything together, and we're going to build a simple hotel website. Okay, so, and you can either use the CSS sandbox starter files, or you can just create the files as you go, like I'm going to be doing in the video. But that's it. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, so up to this point, we've only looked at HTML, which is definitely needed. We need it to actually put stuff on the page, but by itself, it's very ugly. We need CSS to style it and move things around and align and add colors and background and anything else that has to do with layout and style. So in this section, we're going to look at all the basics of CSS. So let's go ahead and create a new folder. And just like we did with HTML, we're going to create a sandbox. So I'm going to call this CSS sandbox, and these files will be in the lecture, the last lecture, the introduction, if you want to download those, or you can just create them along with me. So I'm going to open this with VS Code. So in Visual Studio Code, I'm just going to go ahead and open folder and open up CSS sandbox. And we're going to create in here a new file, and I'm going to call this we'll call it basic.01 underscore basic.html. So I'm just numbering them so you know what order we're going in. And again, you don't have to number them. And if you didn't watch the last section, the HTML section, we are using an extension called Live Server so that we can open our HTML file in a little server and it will auto reload. So you just want to install that if you don't have that yet. All right, I also went over some tips and tricks with shortcuts as well as Emmet, which allows us to write faster HTML. So we can actually do exclamation and hit enter or tab, and it'll give us this basic HTML structure. Okay, so in the title here, I'm going to call this Implementing CSS, because I want to talk about the different ways we can actually bring in CSS. And we're going to look a little bit at selectors, but we're going to talk more about that in the next video. So let's put some basic HTML in here. I'm going to put an H1 and just say heading 1. And then I'm going to copy this down by doing Shift Option or Shift Alt on a Windows machine, and then hit the down arrow twice. So this will be heading 2 and heading 3. And let's actually make this an H2. Make this an H3. Okay, and I'm going to save this, and then we're going to open with Live Server. Okay, and right now I have this, I have them both, the browser and the editor on the same screen, but later on we're going to have to make this bigger if we're going to build, real websites and stuff. So we have 3 headings on the screen, and I'm going to show you 3 different ways to implement CSS. The first is called inline CSS, which is not something that you want to do, but it is something you should know. And this is what we were doing in the last section, the HTML section, when I just wanted to show you a couple examples of stuff. So we use the style tag, and you can actually put CSS in here. Like, let's say we want to use the color property and we want to set that to red. If I go ahead and save that, the heading turns red. Now you don't want to do this, and the reason for that is you want to keep, it's called separation of concerns. You want to keep your styling out of your markup. Okay, you want to keep those 2 things separate, and when you do it like this, you're just clumping it all together. It's much harder to read, it's much harder to change. It's just not good practice, and any developer will give you crap for doing this. So this is not something you want to do, but it's something that you should know you can do. All right, so next one I want to show you is called internal CSS, where it's still on the same page. It's on this HTML page, but it's separate from your HTML. The way that you do this is inside your head tag, you put in a style tag. Okay, and then in here you can just put CSS. Now, when you're using CSS, you need a way to select whatever it is you want to style. Let's say we want to change the color of this H2. Well, we can use the actual element as the selector. So I can say H2 and then open some curly braces, and I can put as many styles in here as I want. So let's say we want color, and let's add green. And if I save that, notice that it turns green. All right, now let's go over this syntax really quick. So if we take a look here, I mean, this is similar to what we just did, except we used color instead of background color. But the first thing here is a selector. In this case, it's an A tag. What we just did was we did the H1, then we did the H2. And you can use the actual tag as a selector, but you can also use IDs, classes. There's something called pseudo selectors. There's a lot of different things we can do for selectors, and we're going to get into that in the next video as well as later on. So that's a selector. Then we have the declaration start. We also have the declaration end. So everything goes within these curly braces. And inside the curly braces, we have a property such as background color or color, as you just saw, and then the value. Okay, and in between that, we have the property value separator, which is a colon. All right, so you have the property and value, and you can add more of these. If we wanted to add a color, we could do that as well. You just want to end each one with a semicolon. So this is basically just a diagram of how CSS works. So we've looked at 2 ways to add CSS: inline, which you don't want to do, and then internal. And I'm just going to put a comment here, and you can have comments in CSS as well. If I hold down Control and hit the question mark or /, you'll see that it adds in a / asterisk and ends with an asterisk /. This is a CSS comment. So in here, I'm just going to say that this is internal CSS. All right. So I'm going to save that, and I'm going to show you the third way, which is external CSS, where you actually have a separate file that you bring in that has all your CSS. So let's create a folder. I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to click the folder icon and call this folder CSS. And in here, let's create a file called style.css. That's a common name for a main style sheet. And you can include more than one style sheet if you want as well. So now that we have a separate file, let's grab this H3 right here. So I'm going to use the H3 element as a selector, and I'm going to do color blue. Okay, we want to end that with a semicolon. Now, if I save this, you'll notice that the H3 is not blue, and the reason for that is this file has no clue that it's supposed to look at that style.css. We actually have to bring that in, and the way that we do that is with a link tag. Okay, HTML has a link tag that we can use in the header, so we'll say link, and then I'll hit enter or tab. And it gives us some necessary attributes such as rel. This tells it basically what type of link is this. It's for a style sheet. And then an href, just like with the a tags, this points to the location that we want to basically load, which in our case is in the folder called CSS, and it's a file called style.css. So if I save this now, you'll see that the H3 changes blue. That's because we're now including this file. Okay, if we don't have this, if I comment this file out and save, it's not going to read it. So you want to make sure that you include your style sheets. Now, out of these three, this is the preferred, okay, using an external CSS file. When we build our projects, when we create a website, all our CSS will be in a separate file. However, for this sandbox, for this section, I'm going to be doing it this way because I don't want, for a couple reasons. One reason, I don't want to have to go back and forth to go to my CSS. I also want you guys to get a big picture of what's going on, so I want you to see the HTML and the CSS at the same time. But usually you would do it this way. You would have a separate file. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So in the next video, we're going to start to look at how to use IDs and classes for selectors, how to use multiple selectors, nested selectors, things like that. So I will see you in the next video. Alright guys, so in the last video I showed you how to implement CSS in a few different ways, and the most common way is going to be by using an external style sheet like a style.css and then bringing it in using the link tag. But like I said, for the sandbox, for this section, I'm going to be using internal CSS and a style tag just so we have everything on one page, just for the sake of learning. Okay, so let's create a new file here. And we're going to call this 02_selectors.html, because what I want to talk about is the different ways that we can select content to style or select elements or tags to style. So let's put in our boilerplate here with VS Code, and let's call this CSS selectors. And we're going to put in some style tags here. Okay, and then as far as the body, I'm going to just put in some simple HTML. We'll have a div, and inside this div, let's do an H2. We'll just say welcome, and paragraph, let's do lorem 20 tab, and then let's do another div, and we'll do another H2, and we'll say about, paragraph, lorem 20 tab. Okay, so let's save this and let's open it up with Live Server if you're using Live Server. So we have two divs with a heading and a paragraph. Now, in the last video, we took an H2 and we gave it a color. Let's go ahead and do that. We'll say green. And if I save that, what happens is it's going to take every single H2 on the page and style it green. Now, there's going to be cases where you don't want every single element, whatever that element is, to be styled. You want to pick and choose what you want to style. Like, let's say we only want this first one to be green. In that case, we would use an ID or a class. So if I were to add ID green dash heading, I could go up here and I could add on to this H2 a number sign which represents an ID and then the name of the ID, and I could have called it absolutely anything. If I save that, notice only the first one is green, okay, because it's targeting this ID. Now this is actually optional. We don't have to put the actual element. However, if we keep it off like that, we could add this green heading ID to anything and it would be in effect. If I added it to a paragraph, it would turn the paragraph color green, although that wouldn't make much sense because we called it green heading. But for the most part, you're not going to see the actual element, at least in my experience. Now, remember what I said about classes and IDs. This is not really something I would put inside of an ID because it doesn't really, for one thing, we might want to use this again. We might want another green heading somewhere. And IDs should be something that there's only one of. So I would actually change this to a class. And then to target a class, the styling is the same way. It's just this right here. Instead of a number sign, you want a dot. So if I save that, notice it's still green. Okay, so just remember, a number sign is for IDs, dot is for classes. And I'm just going to comment this stuff out just so you have some reference. And I'll do an ID and I'll add that as well later on. So now what I want to do is talk a little bit about naming conventions. This is not really a good name because at any point we might want to change this to a different color like blue. Maybe it's a website for a company and they change their branding. So if I save that, it's now blue. And this heading, or I'm sorry, this title here, the class name, makes no sense. So what I would do is I'd call this something like primary heading instead of green heading. Okay, that way it's just your primary color, your heading's primary color. You might even have a secondary heading class if you want a different color. And it doesn't have to just be color. You could change the font size, whatever it is that you want. But you want to think about your naming conventions, okay? And you want to think about the future. Could this change in the future? So calling it green heading is not really a good choice, even though it's gonna work. It's not a smart choice semantically. All right, so now what I want to do is, let's add an ID to these divs. So we'll call this one welcome, and let's call this one about. Okay, so you see how this makes sense because we're not going to have another welcome div or another about div. So an ID is a good choice for this. So if I wanted to, let's say give the welcome ID a background color, I could target it like this, right? And I'll say background or background color. And don't worry about any of these properties. I don't want you to focus on these because we're going to talk about all of these later. I want you to focus on the selectors. So I'm going to give this a background color of a hexadecimal value that's actually a light gray. So if I save that, notice that this only has that background color. So let me put a comment here and say the number sign is for IDs. Now, what if I want to have some styling, but I want it for both of these divs right here? Okay, so if we want to do that, we can use multiple selectors. So what I'll do is I'll take the welcome, okay, the div with the ID of welcome, put a comma, and then put the div with the ID of about, and then put my styling. So let's say I want to give them a border of 1 pixel solid. I'll do, I don't know, light gray. And I'm going to talk about these numbers probably in the next video or the one after that. And then I also want to add a little bit of padding and margin bottom of 5 pixels. All right, so I'm going to save that, and that style was now it was applied to both of these divs because I used multiple selectors, and I could add more if I want. It doesn't have to be IDs. I could put an H2, I could put a paragraph, I could put a class, whatever I want, and that would take on all of these styles in here. Okay, now let's say I wanted to target a specific, for instance, a specific paragraph inside of a specific div. Like, let's say the welcome paragraph, I want that font size to be bigger. What I could do is I could use a nested selector by saying ID welcome and then space paragraph. Okay, you don't want to do a comma. What that means is it means all the divs or all the elements with the ID of welcome in all paragraphs. You don't want that comma because we want to say inside the element of welcome, we want the paragraph inside of it. Okay, and then let's say font size, we'll do 20 pixels. By the way, 16 is the default, but I'll talk about pixels and all that in a little bit. So if I save that, notice that only the welcome div paragraph has the font size of 20. All right, so let's see what else. We can also style the body. So if we go up here, let's say body styling. So we'll take body, and body is usually where you put, like, if you want the whole website or the whole web page to have a background color, you could do that. I'm going to give it a hexadecimal of 333, which is a dark gray. So if I save that, you'll see it changes the whole body. Now the reason we can't read this right here is because by default the text is black. So what I'll do is I'll just target the about, okay, the div with about, and I'll change the color, which is the text color, to white so that we can see it. Okay, and I know this is pretty ugly looking, but I just want you to know the different types of ways to basically select and style different elements. Okay, so instead of body styling, I'm just going to say element selector. Okay, because we're grabbing the actual element or the actual tag. When I say element, I just mean tag. The body itself is the element, div is the element, h2 is the element, with the angle brackets is a tag. So I use them interchangeably. All right, so we have Elementor selectors. Let's just make this consistent here. Element selectors. Dot is for classes. Number is for IDs. We have multiple selectors by using a comma. We have nested selectors, so we can select stuff inside of other elements. And that's pretty much the basics. I mean, we have other things like pseudo selectors and stuff like that, but I'm not going to get into that now. I just want you to understand the fundamentals of selecting elements and being able to style them. All right, so that's it, guys. I will see you in the next video.